Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Medea Benjamin is a longtime activist for peace and sanity. She is the co-founder of the woman-led peace group, Code Pink, as well as the Peace in Ukraine Coalition. She's conducting a nationwide book tour, or has recently concluded it, to discuss a book she co-authored with Nicholas J.S. Davies entitled War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. We had her on to talk about that that book and that war a few weeks ago. And she and Nicholas Davies were just co-authored recently an important piece, I think, one that I'd like you guys to hear about, given the headline In Common Dreams. Anyway, when will the U.S. join the global call to end the Ukraine war? So without any further introduction, Medea Benjamin, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Richard, nice to be on with you.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Let's start with this. I feel as if, we have this illusion in the United States that we have a free press and free access to information, but I feel as if oftentimes in the past decades, but even after the invention of the internet and so on, that we live in a bubble and that a lot of information is either spun for us or kept from us. And that one of the reasons why I mentioned that I think a piece is important is I think my sense is that most Americans don't understand just what an outlier we and a few other countries are on the global stage in terms of our feelings about the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that impression is correct?
Absolutely. I think the American people feel like there is this tight consensus around most of the world that not only can Ukraine win this war militarily, but that the world needs to unite to throw in as much weapons and whatever we can so that they will win, and that Russia is just going to walk away, and that Ukraine is winning this war. So there are certain fundamental things that aren't discussed. Never discussed is the context in which this war happened, the provocations of the U.S., but even the day-to-day coverage of this war, it's almost cartoon-like, as if the drones or the bombs or whatever Ukraine sends into Russia really have an impact, and whatever Russia is sending into Ukraine is not, because they're all being shot down by the forces of the Ukrainian military, which gives the impression, again, that it's just a matter of time until Ukraine takes back every inch of territory in the Donbass and takes back Crimea. And that's just an illusion.
And let me run by you another aspect of the war reporting that strikes me as, as an example of this bubble too, which is the city of Bakhmut. We were originally told not that much strategic importance, but it has symbolic importance. People have gone through and found in the same newspaper headlines that say Bakhmut not important, Bakhmut extremely important. It seems that people are fighting and dying, Ukrainians versus Russians, getting massacred over control of this plot of land that either is or isn't tactically important, which I suspect means it isn't. But it seems to me that all those deaths around Bakhmut on both sides have mostly occurred in order to win the media coverage. Then it's almost like a war for televised purposes, at least in that one front. And I'm wondering if that impression you think is correct.
Absolutely. If you really look at what happened in Bakhmut with fighting for over 6 months for a town of 70,000 people, in which only 500 people have left because most have fled. And there have been so many casualties on the Russian and Ukrainian side. You think, what a senseless waste of lives. What a crazy thing to be doing in this day and age. And yet it is portrayed as something extremely important, just like this long touted and long awaited, but yet not happening yet, counteroffensive by Ukraine is supposed to be determinant of the future of this war. And I feel like the US and the West are putting so much pressure on Ukraine to have some military victory, whether it is to hold on for dear life to that small town of Bakhmut, or whether it's to start this counteroffensive, which even in the leaked Pentagon documents says is not going to, in the best of circumstances, is not going to change the situation on the ground. But yet the media is putting this into some kind of frenzy where Ukraine must show some kind of success on the battlefield, and it will be touted as a success, even if it isn't, because this is what justifies the continued sending in of so many weapons. And, you know, the U.S. has poured over $114 billion into this fight so far, and is still on this idea that no money is too much. We have to keep crossing those red lines. Whatever it is that Biden said he wouldn't do, he now does, whether it's the HIMARS, the Patriot missiles, the tanks, now the F-16s. My fear is that the next request is going to be troops.
Well, and there's been some talk, Medea, maybe you know more about this than I assume you do, but it's some talks that advisors have been there already. And, you know, we're certainly talking about, if I'm correct, but correct me if I'm wrong, training the F-16 pilots, which is obviously, it's not active combat, but, you know, oh boy. Okay, I'm sorry. I set up a makeshift light arrangement here. It started to collapse. But it's, you know, those of us who have memories and or studied history know that originally Vietnam was going to be a training mission too, right? So it begins with a few 200 trainers or whatever, and all of a sudden you're engaged in full-scale military conflict. So I'm a little worried that we may have already, and I understand, I read somewhere that we're providing navigational guidance for drone attacks and missile attack, counterattacks, and so on. So in a sense, we may already be on the ground. Is that true?
I think that's important to bring up, and this ghost of Vietnam, because indeed, we see from those leaked documents that there are already special forces from the US, the UK, and other NATO countries. Now, in these leaks, the numbers are quite small. I don't think we should necessarily believe them because, yes, we have heard about trainers on all this equipment that we're sending in. Do we really think that the trainers are staying in Poland or far from the battlefield? So I think this mission creep, like you said, has already started. And while Biden knows that this is one area where he will quickly lose support for this war if there are Americans that start dying in it, on the other hand, all of these things that he's been sending aren't making a difference. So you decide, yes, okay, we'll send the tanks, doesn't make a difference. You decide, yes, you'll send the F-16s, doesn't make a difference. And what is happening is that the war is going deeper and deeper into Russia itself. So I don't think we are sleepwalking into this. I think we're doing it with our eyes wide open, going into a broader war beyond the confines of Ukraine and getting U.S. and NATO troops directly involved.
And let me, in that context, Medea Benjamin, let me read you something I read this weekend and actually wrote about this weekend too. This past weekend, it was in Politico, and it was headlined, How Biden Got to Yes on F-16s in Ukraine. And it reports that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, now bearing in mind that the traditional role of the Secretary of State has been diplomatic and the role of the Pentagon has been military. But the article says, and I quote, Blinken was a key driver in getting the president to relent, end quote, on sending many of these materials he said he wouldn't send, including the fighter jets, and that in doing so, Blinken overruled the Pentagon, quote, including top military officials, and I'm quoting again Politico, who have long worried about the potential of escalation on the Russian side should the West take such a step as giving Ukraine F-16 capabilities, end quote. In other words, they're reporting that the generals, who we're constantly being fetishized as the masters of war, think it's a really bad idea to send F-16s, but Blinken, the diplomacy guy, supposedly overruled them. And let me just end with this, and then I'd love your thoughts. And then it says, why did he do this? Why did he overrule the generals? Because, and I quote Politico again, Blinken had observed over the past year that Russia rarely escalates beyond rhetoric, even as the West has introduced more military offerings into Ukraine, end quote. And this is what rarely escalates. He invaded Ukraine after you guys told us he wouldn't escalate from that. So now he's invaded Ukraine, which you told us he wouldn't do. You're also telling us he's an irrational madman who might do anything, but you can send nuclear era, weapons like the F-16 that can carry nuclear tipped missiles and so on. And he's going to just say, oh, fine. And that judgment overrules that of the generals and who are worried. You get what I'm driving at, right?
Absolutely. That the people who really know how dangerous this is and where it can lead are the ones in the Pentagon, like Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who at one point said there will not be a victory on the ground. Time to seize the moment and go for negotiations, until others in the White House told him to shush on that. And he hasn't talked much about that again and fallen back in line. But we know, again, from those Pentagon documents, what people on the inside and in the intelligence community really think. In the meantime, you have this guy Blinken, who has been a hawk all along and an advisor to Biden from the days of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he was a cheerleader for the Iraq War and many others, who has really acted like a appendage of the Pentagon, going around the world trying to gin up weapons from countries all over and barely uttering even the word diplomacy. So I think it is very scary when the guy who's supposed to be the number one diplomat has had, in the course of over 1 year of war, one face-to-face meeting with his counterpart in Russia, Lavrov. And that meeting was at the sidelines of a G20 meeting and lasted less than 10 minutes. So we don't have a diplomat, and the cautionary position of people in the Pentagon is being overridden by people who have absolutely no military experience, but are just political ideologues on this.
And, Medea, it seems to me another, disturbing situation here. First of all, it seems as if, we have an amnesiac foreign policy and military policy, as if we've learned nothing in the last 75 years. Another lesson of Vietnam, among other wars, including Iraq, was, you may have a good plan, you may have a bad plan, but you should have some plan. It seems to me the only plan that we ever hear, and the way reason people like you and I get criticized sometimes is, well, we're going to back the Ukrainians until they achieve complete victory. Logical question is, okay, what's victory? And how do you think they're going to achieve it? What's the plan here? And, sometimes people talk as if victory is, well, Putin's going to be overthrown. And, I don't know what they think will happen next. And they'll drive the Russians back, retake Crimea and all that. Well, how's that going to happen? You think the Russians will let that happen? Beats me. So it seems to me, if I read the news correctly, that our policy is backing Ukraine without question until total victory, but we haven't precisely defined what victory is. and we have no idea how to get there. Am I being unfair?
No, you're being totally logical in this absolutely illogical, in fact, insane policy that we have, in which sometimes you hear people like Blinken say that victory is just going back to where things were before the Russian invasion of last year, and sometimes saying, no, victory, which is now Zelensky's position, it wasn't his position earlier on, is that we must get back everything, including Ukraine, despite the fact that including Crimea, despite the fact that there are military people, both in the US and in Europe, that says that increases significantly the likelihood that Russia would use a nuclear weapon. So there is no plan A, much less a plan B or a plan C. We're just going into this by throwing weapons in on this idea. Perhaps the real plan is that put Ukraine in a better bargaining position with this counteroffensive that will miraculously take back enough land to put them in a significantly better position. My feeling is that they're going to end up being in a worse position than they were a month after the invasion, when there was a serious attempt at negotiations and a 15-point plan being agreed upon by Russia and Ukraine until the US and the UK came in to nix it. So all of these lives that have been lost in the interim, and will keep getting lost every day that a peace plan is postponed, is something that is really on the hands of the United States. Of course, Russia should have never invaded, and the blood is on their hands. But as long as the US insists on denigrating any attempts at negotiation, the blood is also on the hands of US policymakers. And that's why we thought it was so important in this article that we wrote, Richard, to show that so many leaders around the world are saying we must step in and do something to bring the warring parties to the table, because the US is not interested in peace.
Well, let's talk about some of those leaders, Medea. Who are they? Where do the U.S. and its allies in this effort, in this war, fit into the global context? And is there, I mean, this is obviously multiple questions, but and is there hope? Are there good prospects in there? Why don't we start with who the people are that are the world leaders that are offering an alternative?
Well, maybe we could start with China, because China came out with its 12-point peace proposal, which is really not a peace proposal. It's kind of a set of principles, like an opening salvo for sitting down to talk. And China has a lot of leverage with both the Russia and with Ukraine, because it's a major trading partner of both. Now, most recently, with the sanctions against Russia, China has become by far the major importer of Russian energy. And so it gives it a lot of leverage. And it's ironic because the U.S. initially said, well, China shouldn't be considered a possible mediator because it does have so much it does have so much influence with the Russians. Well, that's exactly what you need. The U.S. also came up with this ridiculous idea that a ceasefire would be illegal because it would virtually give a stamp of approval to the territory that Russia has taken since the invasion, which is, of course, not true. It's just saying, let's stop the fighting and start the compromise. So China is moving ahead. I mean, in neither side, the Russians and the Ukrainians are saying they want to sit down for talks at this point. But, that's logical. They both want to keep fighting until they're in a better position. It's the responsibility of those who are either supporters of one side or the other, or have influence, to be pushing them to negotiate. So China is in a very good position to do that. The Chinese envoy has had direct talks already with both Putin and Zelensky, and Ukraine's foreign minister and we'll keep those discussions going.
And, it seems to me there's a lot of frustration in Washington, D.C. about China's renewed prominence as a diplomatic force in the Middle East and elsewhere, potentially here. But it seems to me that the U.S. cannot simultaneously project itself militarily and pretend to have the soft power of diplomacy at the same time. It seems to me that whether or not Washington fully understands it, they don't seem to, at least in their public comments, they've sacrificed. It's kind of like you guys don't have a right to complain about China stepping in because you left the void that they're filling when you chose to go the military route, whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine and Russia. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And you were talking about China's recent influence in the Middle East, and you and I have both done work in that area. And it is just amazing that they managed to get Saudi Arabia and Iran together. And this is moving forward with diplomatic embassies being opened up in both of the countries, in trade relations starting up very quickly, and this is having an influence in winding down that catastrophic war in Yemen and really changing things in the Middle East in an amazing speed. So nobody saw that coming and thought that China would be able to broker that. And indeed they did, which gives China more legitimacy in its efforts now to try to bring the Russians and Ukrainians to the table.
What about, Medea, what about the so-called the other BRICS countries? Brazil, obviously Russia's a party to this, India. What are some of the other up and coming economic powers of the global South and elsewhere? Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, it's beautiful to see the role that Brazil's president, known as Lula, has been playing. He was pushed, as most countries have been, to provide weapons to Ukraine, and he came to meet with Biden in the White House. And afterwards, he said, we're not sending weapons to Ukraine. What they need are interlocutors, people who will tell the Russians what a horrific mistake they made by invading and will tell the Ukrainians how they have to go to the table. And he said, we don't want to participate in this war. We want to end this war. And to that end, he has appointed a very, very prominent mediator, Celso Amorim, who used to be the foreign minister in Brazil, was also a defense minister. He was once said by the Foreign Affairs magazine as being the #1 foreign minister in the world, a very accomplished man. And he is now the envoy who is going around trying to get support for this peace club that Lula has talked about, getting nations around the world together to say, we are going to collectively put the pressure on all sides. So I think Brazil's attempt is a very exciting one. It represents the sentiment of the global South. And as you were saying, the BRICS without Russia, there is also the S in the BRICS, and that is South Africa. And South Africa has recently stepped forward as well. And it's very exciting to see South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and other African leaders, in fact, six nations coming together and saying that this war has affected their countries with the price of energy, the price of food going up, and therefore they have a stake in trying to end it. And so they have appointed the president of Senegal, who has served as the chairman of the African Union, to be the head of this 6-member African grouping that has gone now and met with the leaders of both Ukraine and Russia. And the UN has responded very positively to their efforts. So you have representatives who really represent the whole of Africa in this as well.
And one of the Obviously the urgent matter, Medea Benjamin, is to bring an end to the killing and the dying. But that's the priority. But it also strikes me that one of the sort of, I hate to use the word fallout, given the risk of nuclear war, but, one of the collateral effects of this, it seems to be the sort of speeded up evolution of alternative, how do I put this, diplomatic structures, relationships, informal networks, even, when it comes to currency, alternatives to, globally dollar-denominated currency. It seems to me that there's at least the potential now that this is sort of starting to germinate a decentralized alternative web of world power. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. It's quite ironic because on the one hand, it is Russia that we must blame for this terrible invasion. But yet the way that the U.S. is portraying the unity of opposition, that NATO has never been stronger. And it's true that certainly bringing Finland into NATO has only expanded it. Sweden will probably follow suit quite quickly once Erdogan from Turkey gives his okay. And yet you are seeing around the world a sense of, we see this as a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. We also see that the U.S. has misused its hegemony for so many years since World War II and has misused the power of the dollar. And somebody like, Lula said something that I loved. He says, I wake up every morning and think, why do we have to trade in dollars? And I think that's something that leaders in many parts of the world are saying, because the U.S. has misused its dollar hegemony with so many sanctions on so many countries that they have been over the years trying to get around the dollar. And now with Russia in that same boat, it's imperative to get around the dollar. And now you see even countries like Saudi Arabia that used to be so close to the United States are also saying, I don't know that we have to trade in dollars either. So you see a tectonic shifts happening where there are major commodities like energy being traded in bilateral currencies instead of in dollars. You see the Chinese more and more interested in using their own currency for trade. You see the countries of Latin America, for example, Argentina and Brazil, saying they are going to have a collective currency called the SUD. And they are strengthening organizations like CELAC, which is an organization of Latin American, Caribbean countries without the U.S., like the Organization of American States. You see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization being strengthened. You see the influence that China has in the whole continent of Africa and how that has shifted a lot of the trade patterns. So, yes, I think in real time, we're witnessing a very historic transition from a more of a hegemonic unipolar superpower to a multipolar system where the dollar is on the decline and the U.S. empire is on the decline itself.
Yeah, that's certainly my perception. So thank you for that. And I guess maybe last question, but what I'm thinking about, I guess, as we conclude is, okay, you and I have and a number of others, not nearly enough, but a lot of people have talked about the need for negotiations. Now we have a global community coming together, offering ideas for negotiations, support for negotiations. One thing you hear a lot in this country is, well, the Ukrainians don't want to negotiate. They want to keep fighting. We can't dictate to them what they do, which my answer is always no, but we can dictate to ourselves what we're willing to do and willing to support. So this, as much as anything else, is it's not up to anybody else whether we want to endanger a nuclear conflict, whether we want the deaths to go on in Ukraine. If we think it's wrong for the deaths to continue, we have not only the moral right, this is me talking, obviously, but the moral obligation to say, look, we think it's time for a negotiation. And obviously, they're an independent country. They can reject that idea. But maybe we don't send them another $114 billion in weaponry or whatever, because we're also going to have to help them rebuild. So, but that's my thought on it. And I don't know how often you run into that issue, whether it's talking about the new global push for peace, or whether it's just in a general, you have your organization that's calling for peace in Ukraine. I don't know to what extent this comes up for you, but I was just curious before we go, if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, certainly. I think one response is that there have been many times in which the Ukrainians have wanted to talk peace, and the US and the UK have come in and said no, whether that was the talks with Turkish President Erdogan or the talks with the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Naftali Bennett, or the talks that the Chinese have proposed. So the other is that there are many different opinions in Ukraine. Let's not treat it as a monolith. First of all, there are those areas of Ukraine, like in the Donbass, and where people are more pro-Russian, and where they are bearing the brunt of the fighting, not only in this last year, but since 2014. And many people there would certainly like to see an end to the fighting. In fact, when there are polls, they find that, opinion polls taken, they find that in the areas where the worst fighting going on is where there is more support for a peace process. And the other is to say that even if there is tremendous or significant support for continuing the war in Ukraine, that this Ukraine war now affects the entire world. And so we in the world have something to say about it, especially if we think that it might lead us into a nuclear war. And so I want to, before we end, just say that it is important for anybody who feels this way and wants to push for negotiations to get involved. And we do have this coalition called Peace in Ukraine that people could join. It's peaceinukraine.org. We have been doing fantastic work. Lobbying our members of Congress, putting out ads in major newspapers, getting people in the faith-based community to support the Pope's peace mission, trying to promote ways that the U.S. mayors that are feeling their cities affected by this can weigh in to say we need that money at home rather than being sent overseas. Environmental leaders saying that this is catastrophic for the environment. And then there are presidential candidates from Trump to Bobby Kennedy who are taking a line saying we must end this war. So if you'd like to get involved, please join us at either codepink.org or peaceinukraine.org.
Okay, well, Medea Benjamin, as always, thanks for your insights and your good work in this area. I'll admit it's a stretch voting for Donald Trump. I can't kind of see that happening, but we should be at the presidential level. They should be debating the issue. There should be polling on it. All politicians any party should know public opinion on that issue. Particularly the Democrats, I think, are blind not to understand that their war stance may hurt them considerably in swing states in 2024. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yes, and I am not endorsing Donald Trump or Bobby Kennedy. I'm just stating the fact that they see it as a very popular position, which is quite amazing given how the narrative we get from the press, as we talked about. Despite that, more and more people in this country are wanting to see a shift, and those candidates are getting tremendous support because of the position that they're taking on this.
I think you're right. Absolutely right. And again, Medea Benjamin, website is peaceinukraine.org. Thanks for writing this article. Thanks for the great work that organization is doing. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Great to be with you, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity.
Back. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero.